Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
And good Sunday again, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder with the National Weather Service. It's the 27th of July. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your weather forecast and what's going on around your village and community by going to weather.gov/Alaska or arh.noaa.gov. If you go to the pafc.arh.noaa.gov or weather.gov/Anchorage, a lot to remember there, but if you do that on your mobile device, even out in the bush, you can get to a mobile-friendly version of that. Just look at the top of your screen. It'll probably load up that way automatically. And then bookmark that, set it on your home page or in your bookmarks, however you like to do that on your mobile device. And boy, does that load slick and quick and really easy to use no matter where you are in Alaska, as long as you've got Wi-Fi or cell service, of course. The weather info line's open at 800-472-0391. You can find each Weather Service office on Twitter. We've made some posts there today. On Facebook, there's an interesting post there about how much rain South Central has received just in the June to about late July period there, and it is record-setting, so make sure you check that out. And on YouTube, during the afternoon, you get a brief update about the surface weather conditions all around Alaska. It's about 2.5 minutes long, easy to download again, even if you're in the bush. It's not going to take up too much bandwidth there or your cell data plan. Or after this show, go to YouTube, search for AKWX TV. It's Alaska Weather TV for short, and you'll get this entire broadcast there. Or you can find that on our broadcast partners page, alaskapublic.org. A lot of ways to stay up to date, no matter where you are and no matter what's happening in your community. Fire danger is shrinking across Alaska. More and more rain is expected, and with that, I wouldn't be surprised to see this little blip of high fire danger there just west of Northway and close to Tok and the north side of the Alaska Range probably just go away in the next 24 to 36 hours there. More rain coming through, so again, we're still watching that, and with the threat of lightning and thunder expanding a little bit into the early part of the week, it's still something we need to watch. And anytime we have drier winds and gusty winds developing around the mountains, we're going to have to keep close watch on that. But it looks like fire danger is at least at, well, almost a minimum. Not quite there yet. Here's a look out at the west, and once again, if you can find that upside down shaped U pattern, I'll buy you a chicken dinner or something. Here's a look at the upside down pattern. Look at that. It goes up and over the Bering Strait and back into the west coast. This is the jet stream that is controlling our weather pattern. And if you've been watching for several days, you've probably noticed it hasn't moved very much. It's turning into what's called a blocking pattern, where it goes from not moving very much to maybe not moving at all. And as that's the case, it's going to keep active weather that you see trying to fire up here across the North Pacific from traversing the North Pacific and moving into the Gulf, where it becomes more of an active pattern. Instead, this storm is going to have to travel up through the western part of the Bering Sea, up and over the Gulf of Anadyr, through the Bering Strait, and at that point it'll probably drag some cooler air in, and it might even reach into the interior, but it's not going to have the wealth of Pacific moisture with it. So if you're along the Gulf Coast, along the Aleutians, the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, and you're saying, where's my rain? Well, it's here, but it's probably not going to go there anytime soon. Now, across the visible satellite picture looking over Alaska, you can see there is plenty of rain across southeast. In fact, fairly certain that just about every station in southeastern Alaska today reported at least some precipitation, and some more than others. Places like Sitka saw about 0.8 of an inch. Annette saw about 0.9, almost an inch of rain there, probably coming up on that now. Gulkana, a little bit further north, saw about 0.2 of an inch. Cordova and Prince William Sound had about 0.5 inch of rain. Juneau, about 0.2 of an inch. So, yeah, everybody got their fair share in southeast and across some parts of the eastern Copper River Basin and the eastern interior. That's where the bulk of the cloud cover and lift was. We've got a wave of low pressure here, another one south and west of southeastern Alaska, but look at all this dry air that's made it into the interior, south of the Yukon Valley, into southwestern Alaska. And then you get into the fog and stratus across the Bering Sea, and you can see that actually being moved around by high pressure sitting right there. Look, you can even see waves of that stratus moving around there, even though that air is pretty stable and just being pushed down to the sea surface. So pretty interesting stuff on the visible satellite picture, as always. Now, something we see out here across the Yukon is showers and thunderstorms firing up. A few of those were trying to make their way into the eastern interior. The threat should be pretty isolated tonight. As we go ahead to the next couple days, we'll probably start again tomorrow with more of an isolated thunderstorm threat, but see that pick up a little bit more as we head into Tuesday and maybe Wednesday. And we'll be watching for those waves of rain to move out of western Canada and into south central and the central and eastern parts of the interior as we go into the midweek. This is the kind of pattern that we saw earlier in the year where we had those really big dousing rains move through in June. Similar type situation here, so we're just kind of keeping a watchful eye on that. Low pressure in the northern part of the Gulf tonight is pretty weak, but it's enough to dry up the western sections of the Gulf, including Kodiak Island. Temps in the 70s there at least today, and that was just at the airport. Probably warmer inland for sure. Light rain continues for southeast in the northern and eastern Gulf Coast. Here's a weak frontal boundary north of the Alaska Range. High pressure across the lower Yukon Valley and across the Arctic coast. That's keeping low clouds there as well. Low pressure just west of the Bering Strait. And here's our friend, the big surface high pressure system that will not move for anyone at this point. 1,026 millibars there just west of the Pribilofs. Looking at tonight, don't be surprised to run in some areas of light rain north and west of Nunivak Island all the way down to the Alaska Peninsula. Chances are, though, as you get out toward the Pribilofs, it'll become a lot more showery in nature and some light rain on the western side of the ridge as well. Low pressure across the eastern Gulf at 1,014 millibars. Light rain continues for you in southeast. Showers for the Copper River Basin, maybe a brief storm. A better chance for seeing some steadier rainfall in the interior of the Seward Peninsula and in the Noatak and Kobuk Range. Otherwise, fog across the Arctic coast. Showers and storms will be isolated again tomorrow north of the Alaska Range, maybe one around the Copper River Basin, and a chance for some light rain across Prince William Sound and the Kenai Mountains. Light rain continues for southeast, as you would expect, and showers there on the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range to almost the Arctic coast. And out across the western side of the ridge, again, we have some areas of light rain and a few showers for the western chain. Probably some pockets of light rain in the northern Bering, but more stratus and fog than anything else in the Bering Sea. Same goes for tomorrow and Tuesday. It looks like showers again on the western side of the ridge in the Bering. The clouds seem to be breaking up just a little bit more, and look for increasing areas of sunshine across the Brooks Range, the Seward Peninsula, and the northern parts of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. Across the Kuskokwim Valley itself, a better chance of showers generally west of the range. On the north side of the Alaska Range and into south central, we may start to see a better chance for some storms popping up. Some of those could be across the Kenai Peninsula. There is at least a little more instability in the atmosphere as we head into the midweek. Low pressure still lurking here in the Gulf of Alaska, and that could keep some areas of rain, maybe even some heavier pockets of rain moving northward. The better chance of that will be from central to northern sections of southeast. So keep an eye on that. If your streams start to swell a little bit more, if you start to get into some heavier rainfall there, you might need to make sure that your dwelling area and around the house probably not too close to that stream or riverbed. If so, you need to take necessary precautions going into the midweek. So we'll be watching that as well. Looking at southeast, temps today where it wasn't raining actually made it into some mild levels, 50s and 60s there. Juneau about 63, 59 around Yakutat, Annette and Ketchikan also in the mid-50s. Prince William Sound saw temps in the 50s and 60s today. Seward 61, Homer 60 degrees, 68 in Kenai. My goodness, a warm day there. And 67 in Anchorage. Talkeetna was 68. Fairbanks around Denali, also around Healy and Greeley. Temps there in the 50s and 60s, 54 in Eagle. 1 degree cooler there in Northway, 61 in Fort Yukon. Northward, we saw temperatures in the Brooks Range into the 50s today. Ambler and Bettles also looking at temps in the upper 50s. The Arctic coast responded to a little more dry weather, 30s and 40s there. Atkasuk was 40 degrees. Closer to the coast and the ice, of course, 37. Kaktovik, 40 was shown there for you this afternoon. Wainwright, 53. Kotzebue Sound in the 40s and 50s. Nome was 49. Areas of fog there today. 50s for the YK. St. Lawrence Island and Savunga, generally close to 50 degrees this afternoon. McGrath was up to 63. Grayling was 57. Bristol Bay saw temps in the upper 60s to about 70 degrees there in King Salmon. Same goes for Kodiak. Again, a pretty mild day for you. 50s and 60s for the Alaska Peninsula, Sandpoint 63, False Pass and Cold Bay a little bit cooler. 54 on Unalaska Dutch Harbor, about the same there in St. Paul today, and as well as Adak, Atka was showing 50, and Shemya only 51. Now overnight low temperatures will drop into the 40s and 50s again for the chain and a good part of the Bering Sea coast, including Nunivak Island. Bethel about 50, close to that for Nome, though a little bit cooler. Low 30s for the Arctic coast. The interior, upper 30s and low 40s. Southeast, lower 50s for you. Prince William Sound and South Central, upper 40s and lower 50s with high temps there tomorrow in the 50s and 60s. Southeast, upper 50s to lower 60s. The interior probably in the mid 60s. Some areas closer to the Alcan border nearing 70 once again. The Arctic coast could respond nicely to the drier weather, lower to mid 40s, including Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse in the upper 40s, in fact. The Seward Peninsula probably in the mid 50s to lower 60s on the Kotzebue Sound side. The YK Delta in the upper 50s. Bristol Bay likely in the upper 60s, including Dillingham at 67, 50 for St. Paul. And again, temps in the chain probably in the mid to upper 50s there with the Alaska Peninsula a little bit closer to 60 degrees. Flying weather shows a pretty decent but small trough of IFR conditions there along the coast and across the Dixon entrance. Otherwise, a large swath of MVFR for most of southeast. Watch for thunderstorms in the eastern part of the interior tomorrow. An IFR from the Seward Peninsula all the way down to the Bristol Bay region and the north side of the Alaska Peninsula in the central and western chain. Anaktuvuk and Adigan Pass, though, should see improvements over the last couple days. VFR conditions there. Changes coming to Lake Clark, leaning over to MVFR by the end of the day. IFR conditions in Merrill Pass by tomorrow afternoon. Same goes for Rainy Pass. Windy Pass looking like MVFR by the afternoon hours. Isabel Pass should be VFR, but watch for convection and a chance for storms. Mentasta Pass probably looking at some towering cumulus by the end of the afternoon, maybe a storm there, otherwise VFR. Looks like smooth sailing for Tanita Pass tomorrow and good visibility in Portage. VFR conditions expected there and leaning back toward MVFR conditions during the day for Chilkoot and White Pass. Freezing levels show some improvement over that cold pocket we had yesterday across the interior. That is lifting now and filling in with some warmer air. You can see much warmer air out across the Bering and the eastern chain at 14,000 feet for the freezing level there, and 8 to 10,000 feet freezing levels expected across southeastern Alaska, the Arctic coast as low as 6,000 feet near the coast itself. Icing potential seems pretty limited. We've drawn in a few hot spots for you today. Light, isolated, moderate for tomorrow, anywhere from 5 to about 10,000 feet across the eastern Brooks Range, between 8 and 14,000 feet across the lower to mid Yukon Valley, and for southeast about 8 to 15,000 feet. Again, that could be light to isolated, moderate, and wrapping around low pressure and the moisture moving on the west side of the ridge, anywhere above 13,000 feet to probably as high as you want to fly. Could run into at least some light icing potential there. The jet stream shows our pattern well, and again, this is that blocking pattern that is developing and strengthening our high pressure ridge and our low pressure trough across the Gulf. Neither one of these systems are strong enough to move the other out of the way, so we're pretty much going to sit in this pattern, which means what you see is what you get, and you'll have more of it tomorrow. 9,000 foot winds show low pressure across the Gulf. Pretty weak winds on the north side, but the eastern section's looking at some stronger steering winds at 30 to 40 knots coming into southeastern Alaska. Pretty light winds across the interior, at times as strong as 15 knots, rotating around low pressure on the west side of the Alaska Range, and more of a north-northwesterly flow coming down the coast, Seward Peninsula, and over the Alaska Peninsula between about 10 to 20 knots or so. The ridge of high pressure across the southern Bering is also keeping winds light north of the Pribilofs and south of the chain. Low pressures in the same spot across the eastern Gulf. We have light winds in the interior, generally from the north and northeast, and more of a westerly flow, light at this level at 3,000 feet across the Arctic coast. That's running around 10 knots. So turbulence potential, there's really not a whole lot of issues that we expect for tomorrow. Below 5,000 feet for some areas in southern and central southeast, most of that closer to the higher terrain, and out across the western chain below 4,000 feet. Everything else is offshore and over the Bering Sea and across the western sections of the Bering Strait and north. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back with your marine weather and the Ice Edge update here in just a few minutes.
Over the past few decades, the helicopter aeromedical industry has proven itself to be a very effective means of saving the lives of those who are critically ill or injured. However, During the relatively short life of our industry, far too many aeromedical programs, its crews, and sometimes its patients have fallen to tragic accidents. And the highest percentage of these crashes have been caused by human error. Now, often this fact leads us to ask the question, what was the pilot thinking? Why did he act the way he did? And what's even more confusing is why are the same mistakes still being made over and over again throughout our industry? As you go through this training and watch the scenarios, we suggest that you heavily concentrate on the error chain depicted in each scenario and how these steps ultimately lead to a crash. Ask yourself, what were the contributing factors? Were there opportunities to break this chain? Was there a specific culture in a program that affected the pilot's decision making? And finally, were there direct and/or indirect pressures that influenced the pilot's decision? And finally, before we begin with the scenarios, there are two major points to note. First, none of these scenarios are contrived. Each contain multiple contributing factors and influences taken directly from industry accident and incident reports, as well as confidential surveys recently completed by your peers concerning practices and safety problems within our industry. And second, this video would not be possible if it were not for the support of aeromedical helicopter operators, hospital programs, and their crews, as well as all of the other supporting agencies named in the closing credits of this video. These companies donated their equipment, personnel, and the display of their logos to demonstrate unsafe safety practices in the sincere hope that taking a proactive approach through this training will help to significantly improve the safety record of this worthwhile industry. Now let's begin with the first scenario. The day begins with Ann, an experienced flight nurse, in her home about to leave for a day shift. As she leaves, she promises her daughter that she will be home that evening to see her dance in a recital. The morning also starts with Skip, the day shift duty pilot, on the phone with his ex-wife. He is promising her that he will be there at 8 p.m. sharp to pick up the kids for their planned week-long camping trip. Skip's ex-wife reminds him that she too has an obligation that evening and would not appreciate him being late. The shift begins with Skip checking weather, which in the morning is VFR with haze, but is forecasted to diminish to IFR conditions by the end of the shift. This is a VFR program based at an airport. Following his weather check, Skip pre-flights the aircraft, while Ann checks all of the medical supplies and equipment on the aircraft along with Paul, a new flight medic who has just completed training during the past 2 weeks. Following the pre-flight activities, Skip, Ann, and Paul join a program staff meeting where the prior month's activity was reviewed. Flights are down, another flight program in the local area is turning up their marketing efforts, and the hospital administration is getting concerned. The day progresses with no flight requests. Skip keeps himself busy reading magazines while Ann and Paul inspect and clean their equipment. The weather has started to deteriorate, and the new forecast continues to support IFR conditions before the end of the shift. By mid-afternoon, the weather has lowered, with rain showers and mist also added to the amended forecast. Skip feels comfortable to call his ex-wife at 4 p.m. to tell her that the weather has lowered to the point that he doesn't expect to fly and sees no problem with him being on time for the kids. Shortly after that call, a flight request comes in for the transfer of the patient from the requesting hospital to a third hospital. Skip checks the weather, and all points are still reporting basic VFR conditions, even though the forecast is for IFR. Skip is a locally familiar pilot who has flown this route many times before, and although the weather has diminished throughout the day, it's still above the minimums for their operation specifications. He's also concerned about their low flight activity and decides that he can fly the trip and be back in time to beat the IFR weather and pick up his kids on time. Ann questions his decision because of the weather and her concern for getting back to make her daughter's recital. Skip assures her he would not accept the flight if he didn't think he could make it all the way home. Paul, the new crew member, offers no opinion on the decision to fly. The helicopter departs the airport for the requesting hospital. The weather during the first leg is as stated in the weather briefing, and they arrive at the referring hospital without difficulty. The patient is loaded into the helicopter and they depart for the receiving hospital. During this leg, the weather has obviously started to deteriorate due to ceilings, haze, and mist. This causes Skip to have increasing concern as to whether the conditions he's observing will worsen before they get home. In addition to attending to her patient, Anne is also becoming concerned about the weather and its possible effect on getting home. The helicopter arrives at the receiving hospital and the patient is unloaded. While the medical crew is delivering the patient to the appropriate location, Skip receives a telephone weather briefing which reveals marginal VFR to spotty IFR conditions in the area and below Skip's personal comfort level. When the crew returns, he briefs them on the current conditions, his concerns, and suggests calling the hospital van to come and get them and leaving the helicopter overnight. Anne immediately becomes very upset and ridicules Skip for his decision to take the flight in the first place, especially when she questioned the weather from the start and reminds him of her promise to her daughter. She argues that if the weather is at legal operations minimums, and he has flown that route many times before, he should at least try it before he gives up. His thoughts also briefly go to the grief he will receive from his ex-wife for being late to get the kids. He looks to Paul for his thoughts, and he simply says he's willing to go along with whatever the other two decide. Rather than continue the argument, Skip agrees to try it, and they depart for the base.
Time for a quick check of the ice edge, and we're doing these daily now, so those of you on the Arctic coast can see the updates every afternoon there. Simply go to weather.gov/anchorage.ice.php. If I can get that right, that would help. The concentrations of ice here on either the west or the eastern side of Barrow are first year, and they're relatively thin. You've got some higher concentrations northeast of Barrow. Ice in the west is melting. The ice from the east is moving westward there, heading toward Barrow. So there are some more open areas than what we were seeing yesterday, and well, we're getting toward the minimum here in short order. So stay tuned. There will be more tomorrow. Looking at southeast, we've got a northerly flow tomorrow. Light winds about 10 to 15 knots or so coming in from the north through the inner waterways. The exception being in south in the Clarence Strait, 25 knots with a 3 to 5 foot sea developing during the day. More of a southeasterly flow offshore as well. Otherwise, easterlies from Yakutat south of Sitka, 10 to 20 knots with 3 to 6 foot seas are along the coast for your Monday. Now Tuesday, everyone's back into that southerly flow. A south and southeasterly wind with the strongest winds in the Lynn Canal, around 20 knots there with 4 foot seas. A southeasterly flow outside of Gustavus, about 5 foot seas there, and more of a southerly flow west of Craig, 15 knots with a 5 foot sea, otherwise 15 knots with 3 foot seas in the Clarence Strait. So some improvement there tomorrow and Tuesday. For Monday, a southerly flow along the Cook Inlet and west of the Barrens, 10 to 15 knots with 3 to 4 foot seas there, variable winds inside of Shelikof Strait, and light north and northeasterly winds running down the north and northwestern Gulf Coast, including east of Kodiak at 15 knots with a 3 foot sea. Winds become a little more variable inside of Prince William Sound on Tuesday. Northeasterlies inside of Shelikof Strait now with seas up to 3 feet. Northerlies are back for the Cook Inlet there around 10 knots, and also light winds and relatively fair skies across the north and western Gulf for Tuesday. For the Alaska Peninsula, there's a little bit of a stronger flow coming in from the west through Bristol Bay with a 4-foot sea. Higher gusts should be expected as well on the Pacific side with 15 knots and 3 to 4-foot seas there. As we get into Tuesday, expect more of a northerly flow inside of Bristol Bay. Winds pick up a little bit more south of Sandpoint and King Cove to 25 knots with a 4-foot sea, and the winds diminish there south of Kodiak Island and east of Chignik with 15 knots and 4-foot seas on Tuesday. For the Aleutians, a variable flow south of Nikolsky and Unalaska, 10 knots with a 3-foot sea. Otherwise, east and southeasterly winds as you head into the central and western chain. About 20 to 25 knots or so north of Adak and Atka, 4-foot seas there. On the south side, though, seas could be as high as 8 feet. By Tuesday, expect that wind to diminish ever so slightly, but seas stay up there around 8 feet. A northerly flow coming into the eastern chain at 25 knots with a 5-foot sea, and southeasterlies continue west of Atka all the way out towards Shemya at 20 to 25 knots, seas as high as 9 feet around Kiska. For the west coast, look for an onshore flow coming in from due west, 20 knots with a 5 to 6-foot sea, including areas along the YK to Amonik and into Norton Sound. Northwesterly winds for the Kuskokwim Bay at 20 knots with a 5-foot sea, and look for seas to drop to about 3 feet around the Pribilovs on the northwesterly wind. That becomes northerly on Tuesday, a north and northeasterly flow across the northern Bering Sea and the YK coastline. You'll see winds out of Kuskokwim Bay around 20 knots with a 5-foot sea, so those winds will stay up there a little bit more on Tuesday. Across the Arctic coast, easterly still moving that ice along the coastline, 15 knots with 1, 2, and even 3-foot seas now, and northeasterly winds south of Cape Lisburne with 3 to 4-foot seas on Monday. That becomes more of a light northerly wind inside of Kotzebue Sound. Easterlies off of Cape Lisburne up to 20 knots, and more of a northwesterly flow for the eastern and central Beaufort Seacoast. Seas there 1 to 2 feet in ice-free waters. Recapping tonight's weather, light rain continues for southeast. Many areas there will continue to see decent rainfall as we go into the next several days there, some places approaching an inch or more. Out across the west and Noatak and Kobuk valleys there and into the Seward Peninsula, look for light to moderate rain at times tonight through tomorrow. Colder air is locked up west of the Bering Strait. High pressures in charge of the Bering itself, with areas of light rain, drizzle, and more fog and stratus than anything else. Heading into Monday, there's a chance for some isolated storms on either side of the eastern Alaska range. Otherwise, light rain as you head into the lower and middle Yukon Valley. Things are clearing up across the Arctic coast. Improvement continues through Tuesday with a better chance of storms in the east and south central heading into the afternoon. Thanks for watching tonight.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.